Okay, good afternoon, folks. Glad you guys could make it. Again, we have a number of people viewing remotely today, probably at least 25 or so. Everybody else is outside enjoying the weather, I suppose. Today we're going to move into the, I guess it's the maybe third topic of the semester, and it's still hopefully very much a review of stuff that you covered in your micro principles class. And today we're going to do kind of a 1 day only, really fast review of all things supply and demand. In particular, hopefully I'll be able to talk at length about the concept of equilibrium. We're going to, starting next week, we're going to move into some topics that are kind of squarely within the realm of macroeconomics. But one of the reasons why I want to focus on some of these micro topics first is because we're going to apply them over and over again throughout the semester. So for example, a lot of the different macroeconomic models that we talk about, whether it's a macro model of the labor market to help explain unemployment, or a model of the financial system to help explain interest rates, all of those things are really nothing more than applications of some basic micro principles such as supply and demand. So understanding the laws of demand and supply and the concept of equilibrium, I think, are really important to understanding how to apply all of that stuff in a macroeconomic context. So we're going to try to move kind of briskly through this section today. And in the next class, I've reserved some time to do some more problems together. Like those that you might see like on an exam. I normally reserve these days to do these kind of active learning experiment type activities in class, but because we can't do all of that this semester, we'll do some other things. All right, if there's no questions before we get started, let me, to try to motivate the topics that we're gonna cover through today, let me guys ask you a few hypothetical questions. In answering these questions, I don't want you to provide any kind of deep explanation. I basically just want you to think about whether or not the price should go up or down. What does your economic intuition tell you is going to happen to the price in each of these scenarios I'm about to describe? What do you think when let's say that gas prices, automobile fuel, starts to increase and stays high for a long period of time? What do you think is going to happen to the price of things like trucks and SUVs if the price of gas or auto fuel stays high for a long time? What happens to the price of trucks and SUVs? A lot of fingers pointing down, so the price of those kind of cars would go down. What about compact cars or even electric or hybrid cars? What would you expect to see the price happen to those? To maybe go up in response to higher gas prices, okay? What do you think happens to the price of housing, like apartment rent, for example, in major urban areas when people start to move en masse to the suburbs as a consequence of something like a pandemic? The price of apartment rent would probably go down, as we're seeing right now in some big cities like New York and San Francisco. What do you think happens to the price of crude oil in global markets, which we're going to talk about a lot today as our example of supply and demand, if all of a sudden a war were to break out, World War III in the Middle East? What do you think is going to happen to the price of crude oil in global oil markets? Probably go up, all right? I agree with all of you. Now, you may not have connected all of the dots economically in your mind, but the price movements that we've just described are actually caused by the workings of supply and demand. Supply and demand, if you want to think about it more abstractly, are really just the forces in a market economy that cause prices and quantities to move around over time. It's the interaction of supply and demand that determine what the price is at any given time and how much of a good or service or product is actually sold. In today's talk, we're going to break the discussion down into 3 components, and hopefully we'll be able to get through all of them today. It's going to be really organized. The first part, we're going to discuss the buyer's side of the market. That is what comprises market demand. The second part is going to be very much symmetric, but we're going to talk about the seller's side of the market and how we derive market supply from that. The last part of class today will slam the demand and supply curves together and show how they determine price and quantity in equilibrium. When we interact supply and demand, it turns out that we get a unique equilibrium price and quantity. I'm hoping all of this is a review for you guys. I'm going to try to provide a little bit more macroeconomic context as we go through some of the examples, though. But stop me if any of this is confusing or if I'm moving too quickly. All right, so supply and demand, again, refers to the behavior of people as they're interacting with one another in markets. So before we really talk about supply and demand and equilibrium in any real detail, let's, for a few minutes here, review what we actually mean by a market, okay? What is a market in economics? This is nothing more than just a group of buyers and sellers of a particular product. Now, most of the time, a market has buyers and sellers in close proximity to one another. But in today's economy, that need not be the case, right? There's lots of different types of markets in our economy. There are basic retail markets, right? There are stock markets. In that case, the buyer and seller don't need to be next to each other. You can conduct stock trades electronically, right? If you were to purchase anything off of Craigslist or eBay, these are online markets that group buyers and sellers together. Most of you are early on in your, if not all of you, are early in your college career. When you guys get set to graduate a few years from now, you will probably work closely with the career services department of the university. That's also a market. It's a group or a meeting place of buyers and sellers. But in that case, the role of buyers and sellers is flipped from the one that you're normally used to, right? At a career services department, you guys would be the sellers of your labor, and businesses and firms and corporations would be the buyers of your labor, right? So there's markets for goods and services, but there's also markets for labor. That is a factor of production. So there are really lots of different types of markets in a modern dynamic economy like ours. But the main way in which these markets differ is that some markets are more competitive than others. So if you want to think about markets as lying on kind of a continuum, some markets are highly competitive, other markets are not very competitive at all right? So different markets differ from one another because of their degree of competitiveness. In class today, we're going to frame our discussion of supply and demand in the context of a perfectly competitive market. Now, hopefully you guys remember what a perfectly competitive market is. This is one that has many buyers and sellers. And so in other words, there's a lot of people on both the demand and the supply side of the market. And because there are so many economic agents in a competitive market, each individual person has a negligible effect on the price. A perfectly competitive market is basically characterized by two features. First of all, the good or the product or the service that is being sold in a perfectly competitive market is either exactly the same or at least very, very, very close to being the same from one seller to the next. If we combine that with the assumption that there's lots and lots of buyers and lots of potential sellers, then there are so numerous agents in the market that none of these agents have any ability to affect the market price on their own. And so what we say is that everybody in a perfectly competitive market is a price taker. They have no actual market power. The classic example of a perfectly competitive market, or one of the classic examples, might be like two newspaper or magazine stands that occupy the same corner, the same block on in a city somewhere. right? Imagine if, so what's your name? Front row here. I'm going to use you. Say again? Sam. Let's say Sam operates a newspaper stand at one side of the street, and I operate a competitive newspaper stand at the other side, on the other side of the street. We both sell the exact same product, copies of the New York Times or other magazines that are very similar, okay? There's lots of newspaper stands in the city, and so we're all price takers. Let's think about why we have to be a price taker in this situation. Sam, let's suppose that you wake up one morning and you decide to sell your copy of the New York Times for 5 cents more than me. What's likely going to happen in that situation? Everyone that passes by is probably going to buy newspapers from my stand and not from Sam. He's going to have such a huge drop in sales that what is Sam going to have to do? Going to have to lower his price back down to match whatever mine is. Alternatively, Sam, let's say you wake up one morning and decide to charge 5 cents less than I do for a copy of the New York Times. In that case, you're going to have this huge influx of buyers and no one's going to want to buy from me because we're selling the same good in close proximity to one another. What do I have to do? I have to lower my price to match yours. And so what we see in a perfectly competitive environment is that the prices across all the different sellers in that market are basically going to be the same, if not very similar, right? It's why the price of gas costs the same within a few pennies no matter where you go. There's a ton of gas stations in every city, and a gallon of gas is the exact same no matter where you buy it. It's close to a perfectly competitive environment. I want to emphasize this point a little bit because people who don't have much education in economics, who are illiterate in economics, if you will sometimes make the observation that because the price is the same everywhere, that firms must not be competing with one another. That instead there must be some kind of grand collusion to set prices so that there's no competition. Well, that's not true at all, right? In fact, what we see in a perfectly competitive environment is because all goods are basically the same, the prices are going to be really close to one another across all of these different sellers. No one has any pricing power. Each seller is basically going to have to sell his or her product at just a small markup over their own marginal cost. That's kind of the defining characteristic of a perfectly competitive market. In this class today, we're going to assume perfect competition. Is this assumption reality? Of course not. You guys participate in markets all the time. Most of the markets you participate in are probably not perfectly competitive, right? And that's because most of the things we buy are not identical from one seller to the next, right? We don't regard a Ford automobile as the same as a Toyota, right? They're not perfectly substitutable. And so firms, businesses, suppliers have some pricing power for a lot of products in the real world. However, we're going to assume perfect competition for two reasons. One, it's easy to work with. But two, even all of these other markets where there is some pricing power, there's also at least a high degree of competition as well. And so the results that we get here should apply in those markets to some extent as well. So I don't want you to get to the impression that every market that we interact in is perfectly competitive, but the vast majority of the markets that we deal with have a fair amount of competition embedded in them. Okay, any questions so far? Let me look at the buyer's side of the market for the next few minutes here and talk about demand. Let's first start with just a basic definition, okay? Let's review this. What is the quantity demanded refer to? This is the quantity demanded of any good, to be clear, is the amount of that good that buyers are willing and able to purchase. So it's not the amount that buyers want to purchase, it's the amount that buyers are willing and able to purchase. Right? Quantity demanded is all about the willingness to pay among buyers. Now, obviously, there's tons of things that affect our willingness to pay for something. But above all, the most important factor that determines our willingness to pay is going to be the price of that good, right? If the price of concert tickets doubles, most of us are likely going to attend fewer concerts, okay? This relationship that we see between price and quantity demanded that I've just described, it's an inverse or a negative relationship. That is, as price rises, our willingness to pay for the product goes down. That is so pervasive in all the markets that we deal with that economists have given it a special name. It's called the law of demand. It's the claim that the quantity demanded of a good falls when the price of the good rises, other things equal. So there is an inverse or negative relationship between price and quantity demanded, other things equal. What does this part of the definition mean? What do I mean by that? Other things equal. That's important. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. Why do we have to say that? Other things equal. Yeah, second row. Well, that's true, but quality is just one of those factors that could affect our willingness to pay. There's, thousands of different factors, right? And the point being that anytime one of those other factors suddenly changes, that might affect our willingness to pay for something regardless of what the actual price is. So what we want to do in analyzing demand is we want to hold all of those things fixed or constant for the time being and just focus on the relationship between price and quantity demanded. We'll come back to what happens in a little bit when one of those other factors suddenly changes. Okay, let me illustrate demand by just going directly to an example. And the example that I want to use today is the demand and supply for oil, for crude oil. This is a really important input for the production of lots of goods in our economy. So when the price of oil changes, for instance, that's going to cause a lot of fluctuations in the aggregate macroeconomy. Okay, so although we're not talking about macroeconomics today, this particular good that we're going to couch this discussion of supply and demand around is important for macroeconomic models. Okay, so what I've illustrated here is what's called a demand curve for a particular item, for crude oil, all right? Accompanying this demand curve or demand schedule is a demand table, all right, which basically just transcribes the data points that you see in the demand curve. All right, now let's just quickly review how we interpret a demand schedule or a demand curve. As an example, if the price of a barrel of oil, so this is price of oil per barrel, was $20, then what this demand curve tells us is that globally, consumers would be willing and able to purchase at most 25 million barrels per day. That is a horizontal reading of the demand curve. We could look at it with a slightly different interpretation, right? We could read the demand curve vertically, and it would say the following. In order for consumers to purchase 25 million barrels of oil per day, we are willing and able to pay at most $20 per barrel and not a penny more. If oil was more than $20 a barrel, we wouldn't be willing to purchase 25 million barrels per day. Okay, that's a kind of a vertical versus a horizontal interpretation of the market demand curve. Let me throw this question to you. What aspect of this market demand curve reflects the law of demand? What aspect of the market demand curve reflects the law of demand? Fourth row, yeah. In other words, the negative slope of the demand curve. Demand curves slope down. Do not draw an upward sloping demand curve on your exam, okay? I always have one or two people that do that. Demand curves slope down, supply curves slope up, all right? That's because of the law of demand. As the price of oil falls, the quantity demanded of oil in global markets is going to rise. So it's the slope of the demand curve that is telling us something, is reflective of the law of demand. Let me throw out another question that I don't exactly have in the slides. The actual slope, though, in other words, whether the slope is very steep or whether it's close to flat, what aspect of the demand curve does that reflect? This is a concept that you might have seen in your microeconomics class. Anybody? Second row here. That has something to do with elasticity, right? In other words, how sensitive quantity demanded is to changes in price. Let's think about this for a second. If the demand curve for oil were very steep, then what does that tell us? That tells us that a small change in the price of oil per barrel would induce a fairly small change in the quantity demanded. That's an inelastic demand curve. What if the demand curve were closer to, had a much shallower slope or flatter slope? Then a change in the price of oil would lead to a big change in the quantity demanded. In that case, we say that the demand for oil is much more elastic, that consumers' willingness to buy oil is much more sensitive to price changes than it is in the case of an inelastic demand schedule. I don't have those terms in the slides, but occasionally throughout the semester, we will be referring to inelastic versus elastic demand and supply curves. All that really refers to is the relative slope of the two curves. Okay, let me talk for a few minutes about market demand curves, where they come from, and why exactly they slope down, because this is something that I think doesn't quite get enough emphasis in micro principles classes, all right? What exactly is a market demand curve? Where does it come from? Well, a market demand curve, hopefully you all remember this, is really nothing more than the sum of everyone's individual demand curves for that product, right? To figure out how much quantity of a good is demanded in an entire market at a given price, you have to add up everyone's individual demand at that particular price, all right? So why is it then that market demand curves actually slope down? It's not sufficient to simply say quantity demanded rises as price falls. I want you guys to think about this a little bit more, because in the real world, some consumers purchase oil and some consumers don't purchase oil at a given price. Your decision about whether or not you're going to purchase oil might change as the price changes, okay? So as an example here, oil has a lot of different uses in our economy, okay? It turns out that, I had to look this up the other day, but about half of every barrel of oil that is extracted from the ground is actually used to produce a couple of items, mainly automobile fuel and jet fuel. These are really high value uses for oil in the sense that there's not a lot of good substitutes for this product. You have to put gas in your car. Jets have to be fueled to fly around the earth, okay? So these are high value uses for oil. The rest of the other half of every barrel of oil that is extracted from the ground is used for a variety of different products. For example, it's used for heating, energy generation, lubricants, plastics, asphalt, car tires, even rubber ducks, which I've put on the graph here. The point here is that these items are not as high value uses for oil because in some sense there are substitutes that are available for oil as an input into the production of those goods. So everyone who is consuming oil in the economy has a different valuation that they place on that product. Some consumers value oil very highly, others not as much, okay? Here's the punchline. When the price of oil is really high, let's say $120 a barrel, who are going to be the only people in that market that are going to be willing to purchase oil? Only those people that place a really high value on that product, right? As the price of oil drops, however, what happens? Buyers that have a lower value for oil are going to start to enter the market and be willing to purchase, whereas they were purchasing no oil at $120 a barrel. And so what happens as the price falls, all of the high value buyers stay in the market, but now you have low value buyers entering the market. And that's what pushes up the total market demand, right? I don't have a super high value for apples, okay? Sam may love apples. He may be willing to pay $5 per apple. I'm not willing to pay nearly that much for apples, but as the price of apples falls, Sam is going to consume his regular amount, but then at some point, if the price falls below my own private valuation for apples, I will agree to buy one and enter the market, at which point the quantity demanded of apples is going to go up. That's the way I want you guys to think about interpreting a market demand curve, right? As price falls, these low value buyers start to enter the market. Or alternatively, as prices rise, these low value buyers start to exit the market, and all you're left with is the higher value buyers. And so quantity demanded is going to fall. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that subtle but important point is sometimes not emphasized a whole lot in micro principles classes, right? That's what we mean by a market demand curve. All right. So you'll recall from the definition of the law of supply that the demand curve shows how the price affects quantity demanded, other things being held equal, okay? There are, of course, numerous factors that can cause people to change their willingness and ability to buy a product, okay? Anytime one of those things changes, the whole relationship between price and quantity demand is going to change. In other words, the demand curve is going to actually shift, right? So a fixed demand curve traces out the relationship between price and quantity demanded, holding all things constant. As soon as one of those other things changes, like quality, for instance, then the entire demand curve can actually shift around. What I want to do for the next few minutes is talk about some of the more notable factors that cause demand curves to change. I'm not going to ask that you memorize every possible one, but I do want to refamiliarize yourselves with 3 or 4 of them, okay? Just as a silly example here. What if we know that the demand curve for donuts is downward sloping. We all start to go to Krispy Kreme more as the price of donuts falls, right? What if the World Health Organization came out with a report tomorrow that said eating donuts helps prevent COVID-19? Then presumably we're all going to demand more donuts at any given price, right? Whereas I purchased 1 donut a week before, I might be willing to purchase 2 or 3 donuts a week now at the same price. The entire market demand curve in that case would shift to the right. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Now, let me go over with you guys some of the primary factors that cause market demand curves to shift around. And we should be able to move through these kind of briskly here. The first one is a change in the number of buyers. Now, let me be clear about this, because sometimes there's confusion. I'm not talking here about a change in the number of buyers because the price of whatever item we're talking about changes. In the oil example that we just did, I went on and on about how as the price of oil falls, consumers who have a low value use for oil start to enter the market. And so the number of buyers increases. That's not what I'm really talking about here in this example. In this example, what I'm speaking about is, what if there's a change in the number of buyers that has nothing to do with the price of the good in question? Then what would actually happen to the demand curve? Well, let's suppose that the number of buyers of oil increases. As an example, let's suppose that scientists discover some new use for oil, and we need it to produce some new product that we highly value. Then what's going to happen to the market demand curve for oil in this case? It's going to shift to the right. So previously, when we were paying $25 for a barrel of oil, we were willing and able to purchase 70 million barrels per day. But now that we've discovered this new use for oil, at the same price, we're now willing and able to purchase 10 million barrels more per day, up to 80 million barrels per day. Or alternatively, again, if you want to read the demand curve vertically, then this would say, if we're going to still demand 70 million barrels per day, now that we've discovered this new use for oil and there's more buyers in the market, the price might be bid up higher to 50 million barrels per day. I'm sorry, $50 per barrel. So changes in the number of buyers in a market can cause the demand curve to move around. An increase in the number of buyers shifts the demand curve to the right or up. A decrease in the number of buyers, for one of the questions that I asked at the beginning of class today, what happens to apartment rent as city dwellers flee to the suburbs? Apartment rent goes down. Well, that's because the number of buyers of apartments is shifting to the left. A couple of other factors that cause the demand curve to shift that I want you to be familiar with. One important one is, of course, income. What do you think happens to the demand for, let's say, expensive bottles of wine if you were to lose your job and as a result your wages or your income go down? Your demand for expensive bottles of wine is likely to go down, right? In other words, as income falls, your demand for that good falls. The reason why is because the relationship there between demand and income is the same when we're talking about what's known as a normal good. This is a good whose demand rises when income rises, or a good whose demand falls as your income falls. There's another type of good that's the opposite of this relationship, and that is, of course, an inferior good. This is a product or a good whose demand actually rises as income falls, or whose demand falls as income rises. Right, some common goods that are inferior. Ramen noodles, right? Generic items, a bus pass, lottery tickets, right? These aren't items that people with a lot of money generally purchase, right? As income falls, the quantity demanded of these items at the individual level tends to rise. And so we say they're inferior goods. Be careful about that, okay? So I may give you some examples in practice problems or on an exam where I'm asking you to think about how a certain event might cause the demand curve to shift around. If the change is income, you've got to ask yourself whether or not the good you're modeling is an inferior good or a normal good. That will tell you the direction in which the demand curve shifts. How about the prices of related goods? So as another quick example, what do you imagine might happen to the demand for coffee if the price of diet soda, let's say, were to increase, or the price of tea were to increase? The demand for coffee might go up. And why is that? Because the relationship between coffee and diet soda is one that we refer to as substitutes. Two goods are substitutes. If an increase in the price of one causes an increase in the demand for the other, right? If the price of diet soda rises and I substitute away from diet soda into coffee, which is now relatively cheaper, then we would say those two goods are substitutes. And so the prices of related goods can have a big impact on the market demand for the good that we are looking at. Of course, there's other ways that goods can be related. They don't have to be substitutes. They can be complements. Two goods are complements if an increase in the price of one causes a fall in the demand for the other, right? Computers and software, college tuition and college textbooks, right? Mountain bikes and bike helmets. All of these goods are complementary, right? If the price of a mountain bike suddenly doubles, people probably aren't going to buy as many of them. And when they don't buy as many bikes, they're not going to buy as many bike helmets. And so the demand for bike helmets would shift to the left. All right, so related goods, when their prices change, can cause the demand for goods to change. But you have to be careful. Just like with income, you have to ask yourself whether or not the two goods are substitutes or complements. They have opposite effects. A couple of others that I just want to touch on briefly. Changes in consumer tastes or preferences have a big effect on consumer demand. Now, these are basically just kind of arbitrary changes in the public's preferences for certain goods. Economists are not really interested in trying to explain why those tastes suddenly change. What we're interested in doing is analyzing how those changing tastes affect market demand. The example I like to use is back when I was in high school in the 90s, that's how old I am, there was a diet called the Atkins diet that became really popular, like in the mid to late 90s, I think. And it's similar to some of these diets you hear about today, where you want to try to not eat any carbs and load up on proteins, right? So at the time, because it got so popular, I think Jennifer Aniston or one of these actresses in some popular show mentioned something about the Atkins diet, and it was all the craze for like the next 3 or 4 years. So what happened during that time period was that the demand for protein items like chicken and beef and whatnot went up, whereas the demand for items like grains and cereals and rice, all of that went down. Not because of some fundamental shift in the economy, but because people's preferences suddenly changed. So when that happens, you can see market demand curves move around a lot, and that can have a big impact on price. Another one I want to touch on here really quickly that I think might be the most important is expectations. Whether you realize this, most consumers are forward thinking, right? Our buying decisions today don't depend so much on what's happening today in the here and now, but rather on how we think the future is going to play out, okay? You might go ahead and book that expensive vacation if you know that you're going to get a big raise at your job next month. That's the sense in which expectations matter for purchasing, right? Alternatively, you might think that, what do you think would happen, let's say, to your demand for gasoline if you thought that gas prices were going to be a lot more expensive next week? Well, you're probably going to roll those purchases forward a few days and purchase gas when it's relatively cheaper, right? So expectations about what's going to happen tomorrow or next week or even next month can have a big impact on our demand for those items today. Okay, you guys have any questions about that? All of this pretty straightforward. Why don't you take a minute and work this example? There should be some room on the next couple of slides to sketch this demand curve and then illustrate how it shifts. So what I want you to do is draw a demand curve for music downloads, like iTunes, for example. And I want you to see what happens to it in each of the following scenarios and why. What if the price of AirPods suddenly goes down? What happens to the demand curve for music downloads? And part B, what if the price of music downloads falls? Is that me or someone? Did I just hear something? I'm not imagining myself, right? Probably have someone not on mute. Like mute all? I don't want to do that. Sorry about that. Okay. What happens to the market demand curve here for music downloads if each of these two things happens? All right, so this is a pretty straightforward question. Let's first sketch the demand curve for music downloads. Demand curve slope down. So we've got the price of music downloads on the vertical axis, the quantity on the horizontal axis, and then a downward sloping demand schedule. So if the price is P1, quantity demanded, let's say, is Q1. All right, what happens if the price of AirPods suddenly goes down? What do you expect to happen? Go ahead. And why do you say that? That's right. So AirPods and music downloads are complementary. They're complement goods. That's the key there. So you got to recognize the relationship between these two items. If the price of AirPods suddenly falls a lot, people are going to buy more AirPods. Once they do, they're going to realize, hey, I want to purchase more of these music downloads now. And so the demand curve would shift to the right at any price. And now at a price of P1, quantity demanded is higher at Q2. Perfect. How about part B? What if the price of music downloads themselves fall? What happens to the demand curve in that example? I suppose this is somewhat of a trick question. Yeah, first row. Yeah, it's not going to shift the demand schedule at all, right? Remember, if it's the price of music downloads that changes, then we're simply moving down along a fixed demand schedule. Okay, I brought this example up to emphasize a subtle but important difference. There is a difference between a change in demand versus a change in quantity demanded. Economists say a change in demand when they're referring to something that causes the entire demand curve to shift irrespective of what the price is. A change in quantity demanded, this is not just semantics here, is a movement along a given demand curve that can only occur when the price of that good changes. So make sure you don't confuse those two concepts, a change in demand versus quantity demanded. Demand refers to the full relationship between P and Q. Quantity demanded just tells us a specific number at a given price. Okay, any questions so far? All this super easy?
I have a question.
Yes, sorry.
Can you hear me? I'm so sorry.
Taylor, yeah, this is the first time I've taken a question from someone on Zoom, so just bear with me for 1 second. Go ahead.
Sorry. So if you go 2 slides back, since we're talking about this topic with the demand curve shifters,
Yeah.
it says suppose the number of buyers increases. At each price, the quantity of oil demanded will increase.
Yes.
So I'm kind of confused by that because I would think like if the number of buyers increases, that's going to shift it. So why is it like the quantity of oil demanded will increase?
Well, okay, so if I'm understanding your question right, if let's say the price of oil is $25 a barrel, and that currently consumers purchase 70 million barrels per day. Let's suppose that some new use of oil is discovered, and so people who otherwise weren't purchasing oil before are now going to enter the market. And so even if the price stays at $25 per barrel, there may be 10 million more buyers in the market because now oil has this new use. And so the quantity demanded has gone from 70 million barrels per day to 80 million barrels per day. What I'm saying there is that it doesn't matter if we're talking about a price of $25 or $50 or $40 or $10. Every point along the demand curve would shift to the right then because there are now more buyers in the market. If buyers were exiting the market for some reason, then at every price, quantity demanded is now lower, and so the demand curve would shift to the left. Does that answer your question, Taylor?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let me now move on to a discussion of supply, and hopefully we can kind of move through this quickly because in a lot of ways the talk is very much kind of symmetric with what we discussed regarding demand. First off, a definition. The quantity supplied of any good is the amount that sellers are willing and able to sell. All right, now of course there are, again, many things that affect a seller's willingness and ability to supply a good. The most important is obviously going to be the price of that good, right? As the price of automobiles go up, automobile manufacturers are more willing to produce more cars because it's more profitable to do so. So what we tend to see on the seller's side of the market is that as the price of the good rises, sellers are willing and able to produce or bring to the market more of those items. Okay, this relationship is so common across markets that economists have referred to it as the law of supply. It's the claim that the quantity supplied of a good rises when the price of that good rises, other things equal. Here's that phrase again, telling us that there's lots of other things that affect firms' supply decision that don't have anything to do with the price of the good. If we hold those factors constant, we should see a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. We call that the law of supply. Let me go back to my oil example. Here is a supply curve for oil in the global market for oil. It's nothing more than a function that shows the quantity of oil supplied at different prices. Here's the supply curve, and here is a supply table that just transcribes all these points from the graph. Okay, so again, how do we interpret this or read it? If the price of oil is $20 a barrel, for example, the supply curve says that suppliers are willing and able to bring to the market 30 million barrels per day. Or alternatively, you could read it like this. In order to bring 30 million barrels of oil to the market per day, suppliers require $20 per barrel and not a penny less. If oil prices fall any less than that, then suppliers are not willing to produce 30 million barrels anymore. Just like with the demand curve, what aspect of the supply curve here reflects the law of supply? It is the upward slope, right? As the price of oil rises, it's more profitable to produce oil, so the quantity supplied goes up. And the actual size of that slope, again, tells us something about elasticity. That is, how sensitive supply decisions are to changes in price, right? So if the price were to rise by just a little bit, if that causes a huge change in quantity supplied, we would say the supply curve is highly elastic or would be pretty flat. An inelastic supply curve is one that is super steep, where a small change in the price of oil induces a pretty small change in quantity supplied. So this elasticity concept applies to both the demand and the supply curves. Let me talk now for just a couple of minutes about why it is that market supply curves actually slope up. So this is going to mirror this discussion we had about why market demand curves slope down, okay? Now let me revisit that for just a second because I think this was an important point. What did we discover in the context of our talk about demand? That we have all these different consumers of oil across the globe. And all those different consumers have a different value that they place on oil. When oil's really expensive, only the high value buyers participate. But as oil prices fall, the lower value buyers start to enter the market and quantity demanded goes up. Something very similar like that explains why supply curves are upward sloping. In the real world, you've got different suppliers of oil that face very different costs, okay? For example, a lot of the oil companies based out of the Middle East, in these OPEC participating countries, the oil is really close to the surface and the extraction costs are pretty low. And so those companies, those countries can produce oil profitably even if the price that they're receiving for oil is relatively low. They have low extraction costs, all right? However, there are other parts of the world where it's more costly to get oil out of the ground. It's deeper down, it's spread farther out. In the case of the shale oil, in a lot of parts of this country, you actually have to heat up the rock to get the oil out of the ground. And so the extraction costs are actually higher. Now, why do I bring this up? Because these different costs of production are going to have an impact on the shape of the supply curve. Think about it. If the price of oil was $20 a barrel, then only those companies or those countries that can produce oil or extract oil at a low cost are going to be willing to supply, right? But as oil prices climb, companies or countries that face higher extraction costs are willing to enter the market and supply oil. Oil has to be at least $50 or $60 a barrel, however, in order to make it profitable for everyone to participate. So the market demand curve slopes down because you've got buyers that have different kind of subjective valuations for the good that we're talking about. So market supply curves slope up because all the different sellers have different costs. And as the price rises, the low cost and high cost sellers are willing to participate. By the way, this graph reminds me of the strategy that a lot of these Middle Eastern countries are taking with regard to trying to compete with the United States in oil production. I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but in the US, I believe, is now maybe the #1 or #2 oil supplier in the whole world. And that's because through technological advancements in fracking and this kind of horizontal drilling, we've been able to reach and tap into oil reserves at a lower cost than we were previously able to do. Well, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, a lot of these countries don't like that very much. And so the way they've tried to compete with the US is supply a ton of oil to push the price of oil in global markets down to a point where domestic companies in the US no longer find it profitable to extract oil. They're basically trying to price us out of the market. I don't think it's working too well in the long run because there have been such improvements in technology that have allowed us to extract that oil at ever lower and lower costs. But that's basically the strategy they've employed the last several years. And that's why gas prices, for instance, have been so low, at least for 8 or 9 years by now. Let me just talk briefly now about some things that cause the supply curve to shift, right? So the supply curve shows how price and quantity supplied are positively related, other things being equal. These other things are these non-price factors, which might cause the supply curve to move around. Again, I'm not going to require that you guys be super familiar with every possible thing that might cause market supply curves to be disturbed. But there are 4 that I think are pretty common that we should review. One is input prices. One I've already talked about a little bit here is technology, technological improvements, number of sellers. This mirrors our discussion of the number of buyers from earlier, and also expectations. All right, you guys tell me, how do you think input prices affects the supply curve? If a company's input prices suddenly go up, how do you think that affects its willingness and ability to supply its output? So inputs are things like labor, capital, other material costs. Yeah. Sorry? Yeah, so if input prices rise, then firms are going to realize fewer profits at a given price for their product. And so the higher are the input prices, the less profitable selling becomes. And so firms are probably going to want to reduce the supply, which means that the supply curve would shift to the left or back. If input prices were to decline, you would have the opposite effect. Firms are now more profitable, and so they're willing to produce more of those goods and services. What about technology? How is an improvement in technology, you think, going to affect a firm's supply decision? Yeah, fourth row. Bingo, right? First off, what do we mean when macroeconomists talk about technology, okay? We mean something kind of abstract about that. All right, that is, technology is the way we transform inputs into output. So if there's an improvement in technology, then what's happening is a firm can now produce more output for a given amount of inputs, right? Or alternatively, the same amount of inputs is now producing more goods and services, right? And so a lot of times, the way we can interpret that is through some type of cost saving like you've talked about, right? So if there's a technological improvement that allows a business to produce more with fewer inputs, that's functionally the same as a reduction in input prices, and so should increase supply. Number of sellers, again, this is pretty straightforward. If a new oil discovery was made somewhere in the middle of the country, right, and we had new suppliers enter the market, that's going to shift the market supply curve to the right. If sellers exit the market, the supply curve will shift to the left. Do you guys remember the Deepwater Horizon accident from several years ago in the Gulf of Mexico? So this oil rig in the Gulf of Mexico had this massive oil leak, right? And I don't remember exactly how long it went on, but it seemed like for maybe months, that entire rig was shut down, not pumping oil from beneath the Earth's surface. Well, that's the same as if a big seller had exited the market. And so the supply of oil fell, and as a result of that, the price went up in the market. Expectations. Expectations are also a big, important factor with regard to sellers' willingness and ability to supply a product, okay? What's your name here on the first row? Matt? Okay. Sorry, I know I've asked you that a couple of times. Let's say Matt here is the CEO of a oil company in Texas, okay? Matt, let's say your economic forecasting team is telling you that the price of Texas crude oil is going to be higher next month. How do you think that might affect your willingness to supply oil right now to the market if you anticipate much higher prices for your product a month from now? You would want to shift your supply from the present to the future. And so you might lower your supply today, reserve some of that oil to take advantage of the higher prices in the future. Or alternatively, if you think that prices are going to be lower in the future, that might cause you to want to increase your supply today to take advantage of the relatively higher prices. My point being in this example is that expectations of the future have just as much of an impact on people's buying decisions as they do on businesses' selling decisions. Okay? All right. Here's an example that you guys can do with me here. We have an upward sloping supply curve for oil. Let's say the price of oil is $50 a barrel and 20 million barrels are supplied by the market. What happens if the wages of oil rig workers suddenly go down? So let's say they were in a union, that union has now dissolved, and so wages are going to decline. What do you anticipate happening to the supply, the market supply curve for oil in this case, and why? Matt? That's right. Wages of oil rig workers, those oil rig workers are inputs. Labor is the primary input into production. So if wages fall, input prices fall, and as a result, the supply curve for whatever good you're talking about is going to tend to shift to the right. Now, this is a rather extreme example. I have the supply curve shifting to the right by 60 million barrels. That's not realistic. But the point is that as wages or input prices fall, that should put rightward pressure on the supply curve. It'll shift to the right or down. So at $50 per barrel, now firms are willing to supply 80 million barrels, or alternatively, supplying 20 million barrels will be done at a much lower price per barrel at 10 bucks instead of 50 bucks. All right, let's do one last exercise. I'll throw this one to you guys, and then we'll stop for today, and we'll finish our discussion of equilibrium in the next class and reserve quite a bit of time to work some practice problems together. So on the next slide, I want you guys to draw a supply curve for tax return preparation software. So I'm thinking something like TurboTax, okay? What happens to the supply curve for that product in each of the following situations? What if there's a technological advance that allows the software to be produced at a lower cost? And B, let's say professional tax return preparers, I guess I could have just said accountants, raise the price of the services that they provide. How does the market supply curve for something like TurboTax, how is it affected by these two changes, A and B? Would you guys take a minute or two and illustrate that on the next couple of slides, and then we'll go over the answer together. Everybody got an answer for part A. What happens to the supply curve for tax return software if there is a technological improvement in this case? Yeah, what's your name again? I'm sorry. Sean, go ahead. It's going to shift to the right. Exactly. So now this is very much like a reduction in input prices, right? The software company can produce the product at a lower cost, and so the supply curve is going to shift to the right. At a price of P1, they're now willing to supply Q2 instead of Q1. How about part B? What happens if accountants raise the price of the service that they provide? How would that affect the market supply curve for tax software if accountants raise the price of the service they provide? I guess I'm guilty of asking you another trick question. Yeah, back row. Speak up just a little bit louder for me. Well, so a product like TurboTax is regarded as a substitute, usually, for the services of an accountant, right? And so, another hand up over here. Anybody want to guess? No? Yeah? I agree with that. Yeah. And so in this example, it probably wouldn't affect the supply curve directly. It would probably affect the demand curve for TurboTax, right? If accountants suddenly are charging more for their services, then I, as a purchaser, would substitute away from that service into TurboTax. But I don't believe that would directly affect the willingness and ability of the suppliers of this product to bring it to market. Yeah, second row. Well, because they're technically two different things. You could have the price of labor being flat. You could have the price of materials not changing. But if there's an improvement in technology, that's going to boost supply even though input prices haven't actually changed. So that's kind of why we separate the two. But it has ultimately the same type of effect, though. And it's because technology is defined as how producers transform their physical inputs into output. So if there's an improvement in technology, the same amount of inputs produce even more output, right? Well, that would be very similar to like a reduction in input prices that allowed you to buy more inputs to produce more output. So it's a different thing, but ultimately ends up having the same type of effect on output. So they're definitely cousins, but they're still different. Okay, any other questions before we go? So I didn't quite get as much done as I wanted to today. That's fine. I've got plenty of time. What we'll do, the first probably 15 minutes of class on Thursday, we'll finish up these slides and talk about this concept of equilibrium, a very important concept. And then I promise we will do some kind of practice review questions together, maybe using the document camera for the remainder of class. Okay? Thank you, guys.